and I would be there trying to lift you up. Sometimes you want to go to the bench. I said, "Oh no,
No, you got to come this way. This way.
We need it. It's a third down. You can't go out now."
Yeah.
But you took a lot of hits during your career, and
he ran 99 yards into NFL history. He won a Super Bowl before he'd even paid off his rookie contract. But behind the highlight reels, Tony Dorsett was quietly carrying wounds that took decades to surface. Now, at 72, the Hall of Fame running back's story is finally being pieced together. The heartbreaks, the betrayals, and the battle happening inside his own head. This is the side of Tony Dorsett the trophies never showed you. Glory and ghosts. Before the NFL ever knew his name, Tony Dorsett was already a legend in western Pennsylvania. Growing up in Aliquippa, the son of Wes and Myrtle Dorsett, he starred at Hopewell High School before staying close to home to play for the University of Pittsburgh. As a freshman in 1973, he rushed for 1,586 yards, a college football record for a first-year player at the time. And he never really slowed down from there. By his senior season in 1976, Dorsett had turned Pitt into a national powerhouse, leading the Panthers to a perfect 12-0 record and a national championship. That same year, he ran away with the Heisman Trophy, finishing his college career with 6,082 rushing yards, an NCAA record that stood for 22 years. Reportedly, teammates described trying to tackle him in practice as something close to impossible, comparing it to chasing a fly around a room. The Dallas Cowboys made him the second overall pick in the 1977 NFL Draft, and Dorsett didn't waste any time making it look easy at the professional level, too. He was named NFL Offensive Rookie of the Year, and by the end of that very first season, he had a Super Bowl ring, as the Cowboys beat the Denver Broncos in Super Bowl 12. From there, the accolades piled up. 4 trips to the Pro Bowl, a first-team All-Pro selection in 1981, and then, on Monday Night Football against the Minnesota Vikings in 1982, Dorsett authored one of the most unbelievable plays in league history, a 99-yard touchdown run, a record that, by simple math, can never be broken, only matched. Dorsett wasn't just a rookie sensation who faded either. He rushed for over 1,000 yards in 8 of his first 9 professional seasons, missing the mark only once during the strike-shortened 1982 campaign. Across his career, he played in 5 NFC Championship games and 2 Super Bowls, piling up over 1,300 rushing yards in the postseason alone. By the time he finally walked away from football, Dorsett had rushed for 12,739 yards, at the time the second most in NFL history, behind only Walter Payton. In 1994, both the Pro Football Hall of Fame and the College Football Hall of Fame opened their doors to him, and the Cowboys later enshrined him in their own Ring of Honor. On paper, it reads like a football fairy tale from start to finish. Here's the thing about legends. The highlight reel is never the whole story. And if you ask the people who were actually in the room with Tony Dorsett across those years, the moments that shaped him most weren't the ones with confetti falling. They were the ones nobody wanted to talk about afterward. So what actually happened behind those glory years that Dorsett has spent decades quietly trying to make peace with? The Washington heartbreak. Let's start with the one that still stings the most. In January of 1983, the Dallas Cowboys marched into RFK Stadium in Washington for the NFC Championship game, one win away from a trip to Super Bowl 17. The stadium was packed to capacity. The January air was bitterly cold, and by most accounts, the crowd was as hostile and deafening as anything Dorsett had ever played in front of. Washington controlled the game from start to finish, closing it out 31-17 and denying the Cowboys a chance at what would have been their 6th Super Bowl appearance. For a Dallas team that had spent the season being called America's team, it was a gutting way for a promising year to end. Not just a football game lost, but a shot at glory that had felt, for most of that season, like it was already within reach. Reportedly, the locker room afterward was almost completely silent. No shouting, no finger-pointing, just exhausted, defeated men sitting with the reality that an entire season had ended in someone else's building, in front of someone else's fans. For Dorsett, who had already tasted a championship as a rookie just a few years earlier, the loss became one of those moments that quietly lingers for the rest of a career. Not because of what was said in that locker room, but because of what wasn't. What made it sting even harder was the rivalry itself. Dallas and Washington had spent years trading blows for supremacy in the NFC East, and this wasn't just a game. It was a chance to finally settle the argument in the Cowboys' favor on the biggest stage available. Instead, Washington went on to win Super Bowl 17 a little over a week later, while Dorsett and the Cowboys were left to fly home and watch it happen from a distance. For a franchise that prided itself on being America's team, there was reportedly nothing more painful than being the team other people got to celebrate beating. If a locker room can go completely silent after a loss like that, what does it actually say about how much that one game meant to the men inside it? The Landry years. Respect wrapped in resentment. Then there was Tom Landry. If you know anything about Landry, you know the image. The fedora, the stoic expression on the sideline, a coach who ran his program with the precision of a system rather than the warmth of a father figure. For a young, electrifying playmaker like Dorsett, that dynamic wasn't always easy to swallow, especially early on. By his own accounts over the years, Dorsett bristled at Landry's rigid, disciplined approach when he first arrived in Dallas. He wanted more freedom on the field, more recognition as the singular talent teammates and opponents alike already knew he was. And Landry's system-first philosophy didn't always seem to leave room for that. There were reportedly stretches where Dorsett felt like just another cog in Landry's machine, rather than the generational player capable of taking over a game by himself. But here's where the story gets more complicated and more human. As Dorsett got older, his perspective on Landry reportedly shifted. What once felt like coldness started to look, in hindsight, more like professionalism. What once felt like a lack of trust started to look more like a coach who simply demanded excellence from everyone under him, including his most gifted player. Dorsett has spoken over the years about coming to appreciate that Landry's demands were never personal. They were about winning consistently, season after season, and doing things the right way even when it wasn't glamorous. It's a familiar story in sports, the player who resents the coach in the moment, only to understand him decades later, once the anger has had time to cool. Landry, after all, coached the Cowboys for 29 seasons, building a reputation as one of the most disciplined and successful head coaches the league had ever seen. And Dorsett was one of the many talented players who had to learn to fit inside that system rather than around it. But how many athletes actually get the chance to make peace with that relationship at all before it's too late? Herschel Walker and the beginning of the end. If the Landry relationship was a slow burn, the arrival of Herschel Walker was a gut punch. By the mid-1980s, cracks had already started forming between Dorsett and the Cowboys organization. Ahead of the 1985 season, Dorsett held out, pushing for his contract to be renegotiated, reportedly frustrated that his financial issues had become public and that teammate Randy White had been given a bigger deal than his own. Then Dallas signed Herschel Walker, a punishing do-it-all back out of the USFL, to a 5-year, $5 million contract, a deal that reportedly outpaced what Dorsett himself was making, despite Dorsett being the franchise's all-time leading rusher and the player who had defined the Cowboys' backfield for nearly a decade. For Dorsett, it reportedly wasn't just a business decision. It was personal. This was a franchise he had given 11 seasons to, the only NFL team he had ever known, the team he'd helped carry to a championship as a rookie. Watching the organization invest in his eventual replacement while he was still productive on the field left him, by his own admission, feeling like the team he'd helped build was ready to move on without him. In June of 1988, that feeling became official. The Cowboys traded Dorsett to the Denver Broncos for nothing more than a conditional 5th-round draft pick, a stunningly small return for a future Hall of Famer who was, at that point, the franchise's career rushing leader. Dorsett has since admitted more than once that leaving Dallas was driven as much by pride as by football logic. Looking back on it years later, he's called the decision to leave probably one of the worst moves he made, admitting he simply wanted somebody to want him after all the years and all the hits he'd absorbed in Dallas. There's also an eerie parallel that Dorsett himself has pointed out. Years later, he drew a comparison between his own exit from Dallas and Peyton Manning's eventual departure from Indianapolis. Both men had spent over a decade being the face of the franchise that drafted them. Both were nudged toward the door once the front office decided to build around someone younger, and both wound up finishing their careers in Denver as a result. For Manning, the move became one final championship chapter. For Dorsett, it became something far more complicated. When a franchise trades away the player who helped define its identity for little more than a conditional late-round pick, what does that say about how replaceable even the greatest players eventually become? One season, one injury, one ending. Dorsett's stint in Denver started out with real promise. At 34 years old, he led the Broncos in rushing during the 1988 season with over 700 yards, still showing flashes of the speed that had once made him nearly impossible to bring down in the open field. For a moment, it genuinely looked like the move might extend his story a little longer. Then came training camp in August of 1989. During a routine, non-contact passing drill, no pads, no hits, nothing dramatic, Dorsett's knee simply gave out underneath him. He collapsed to the turf on an ordinary pass route, and doctors later discovered extensive ligament and cartilage damage that required immediate surgery. There was talk of a full reconstruction, months of rehabilitation, and ultimately, an ending Dorsett never got the chance to script for himself. Speaking to reporters on crutches at that same training camp, a visibly shaken Dorsett admitted he had faced the facts. His career was very likely over. This could possibly be it, he reportedly told reporters at the time, adding that he wasn't sure he could overcome the damage to his knee. He later reflected that it wasn't the thousands of ferocious hits or brutal collisions across 12 professional seasons that finally ended things. It was his own body simply refusing to cooperate anymore on an ordinary day during an ordinary drill. For a man who had taken hit after hit for more than a decade without ever missing significant time to injury, it was a strange, almost anticlimactic way for the story to close. Even the Broncos' own training staff seemed stunned by how it happened. Team trainers reportedly described the injury as the first major one of Dorsett's entire career, spanning high school, college, and the pros, and openly questioned whether the 35-year-old had enough left in the tank to fight back from a full ligament reconstruction. In the end, he never played another regular season down. How do you make peace with a career-ending injury that didn't even come from a hit? The battle nobody could see coming. But the physical toll of Dorsett's playing career didn't end with a torn-up knee in 1989. Years later, a very different kind of damage started to surface. The kind you can't see on an X-ray, and the kind that doesn't announce itself until long after the cheering has stopped. In late 2013, Dorsett became one of the first living former NFL players to be diagnosed with signs consistent with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, commonly known as CTE, a degenerative brain condition that researchers have linked to repeated head trauma. Doctors at UCLA evaluated him alongside fellow Hall of Famer Joe DeLamielleure and former All-Pro linebacker Leonard Marshall, using specialized brain scans that identified a buildup of tau, an abnormal protein found in the brains of other former players who had struggled with memory loss, depression, and mood instability. Dorsett has spoken candidly in multiple interviews over the years about what that diagnosis has meant for his day-to-day life. He's described forgetting how to drive his own daughters to practice, a route he'd driven for years without a second thought. He's talked about mood swings severe enough that his daughters, by his own account, weren't always sure which version of their father they'd get on a given day, reportedly telling him directly that his temper frightened them at times. He's described the frustration of losing pieces of memory that most people take completely for granted, at one point saying doctors had told him he was clinically depressed as well. It's worth being precise here, because the science matters. CTE can only be conclusively diagnosed after death, through direct examination of brain tissue. What Dorsett has publicly discussed is a diagnosis of symptoms and scan results consistent with the disease during his lifetime, not a definitive in-life confirmation, which medicine currently cannot provide. But regardless of that technical distinction, The symptoms themselves have reportedly been very real for Dorsett and very difficult for the people closest to him. Years after his initial diagnosis, he described himself as still in a battle, admitting he never imagined the end of his football journey would look anything like this. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that Dorsett's struggle didn't arrive with some dramatic warning. There was no final game where everyone could point to one moment and say, "That's when everything changed." Instead, the problems appeared gradually, quietly, and in ordinary moments. Forgetting a familiar route, struggling with emotions, watching family members notice changes before he fully understood them himself. For someone whose entire career had been built around control, speed, and knowing exactly where to go next, losing that certainty must have been especially difficult. The football field had always been the place where Dorsett knew exactly who he was. Now, outside it, the rules had changed. Dorsett wasn't alone in that discovery either. He was one of several men from that same brutal, hard-hitting era of football quietly learning, years after their final games, that the sport had left something behind in their brains that no championship ring could ever make up for. He was also among the thousands of former players who joined a massive concussion-related lawsuit against the NFL, a case that was ultimately settled for a reported $765 million, a number that, for many former players, felt less like justice and more like a quiet acknowledgement of what the game had cost them. If the damage doesn't show up until decades after the final whistle, how many other legends out there are still waiting to find out what their careers really cost them? So who is the real Tony Dorsett at 72? He's not just the kid from Aliquippa who ran for 99 yards, or the Heisman winner who never lost a college game his senior year, or the rookie who won a championship before he'd even settled into the league. He's a man who lost a heartbreaking championship game in the cold at RFK Stadium, who spent years learning to understand a coach he once resented, who watched his own franchise quietly move on without him, and who is still, to this day, working to hold on to his own memories, one day at a time. Football gave Tony Dorsett almost everything: the records, the rings, the Heisman, the bust in Canton. But by his own account, it also took things from him that no amount of stats can ever replace. And yet, when the conversation turns to whether he'd tell his younger self to walk away from it all, Dorsett has made clear that isn't the lesson he'd pass on. The lesson, it seems, isn't to run from the game. It's to pay closer attention to what it's actually costing you while you're still in the middle of it. Decades from now, Dorsett's name will still be etched into the record books. The 99-yard run, the Heisman, the perfect pit season, the rings. But maybe the more important part of his legacy is the honesty he's shown in his 70s, in talking openly about the parts of his career that hurt the most, at a time when plenty of players from his era chose to stay quiet. If Tony Dorsett's story hit different than you expected, let us know in the comments which part surprised you the most. And don't forget to subscribe, because there are a lot more untold stories like this one still waiting to come out.